Good afternoon, I'm Alec Margolin. I'm here today with Paul Hopper, founder and chairman of Imugene. Paul, we're both roughly in biotech. I get this question a whole bunch. What is biotech, from your perspective at least?
Yes, that's a definition which is a little bit hard to pin down, but from my perspective, it's from a commercial point of view, it's an industry, in my case, that is focused on developing and finding therapeutic drugs for cancer. Look, it includes devices, diagnostics, and lots of other areas, but in my case, my companies are very much focused on finding drugs that would provide a cure to oncology or cancer.
There's so many different avenues of biotech, of course. Where we got like medical, agricultural, environmental, the list really goes on. But your focus is, of course, on cancer. And what I kind of want to know is, how did you get into cancer? Why is cancer a bigger industry compared to some of the other facets of biotech?
Well, the cancer area of biotechnology is probably the biggest market in the world. That's where there's a massive amount of activity that takes place. I just fell into it. I was in the private hospital business here in Australia, had a listed company, and it was taken over by Ramsay Healthcare in the early 2000s. And I went to the US to just look around, and I met some oncologists who were doing some fascinating work in, at that stage I hardly understood it, some arcane area of oncology, and it was incredibly stimulating, and it was like a light went on, and I thought, wow, I'm going to get involved in it. So from there I proceeded to do everything I could to find out about it, and eventually wound up starting some companies, and it went from there.
So you just mentioned big pharma. Is there a difference between big pharma and biotech?
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
So big pharma, I guess, is traditionally the top 10 companies, which are household brand names that have got multiple divisions, tens of thousands of people working for them, market caps of 100 billion.
So the Panadol you have in your cupboard or something like that?
Exactly. So they've got massive inbuilt R&D facilities all over the world. But the biotech sector is an important part to them, because in a funny sort of way, it's become a incubator, almost like a nursery. So they spend a lot of their time scouring the world, looking at all the little biotech companies to see what they've got in their cupboard, because they don't have a monopoly on good ideas, and there's many cases where a little homegrown piece of technology has turned out to be extremely promising. If you take the case of Viralytics, which I was the chairman of, 10 years ago that had a value of 4 million. It was broke, and we sold it in June this year for 502 million to Merck. And that was an invention of Professor Darren Schaffman at Newcastle University. So Merck found that and liked it. So if you go to, there's numerous big biotech conferences around the world, massive conferences. ASCO, which is one, they have over 30,000 people at that. Every single big pharma company in the world is there. They take a whole floor in a hotel. They bring 30 people. They'll bring someone who's a specialist in metabolic disease. They'll bring people they'll bring many people from cancer. They'll bring people from cardiology, and they set them all up in rooms in the hotel. And if you're a little biotech and you're wanting to do a deal with them, you do what we call speed dating. So you get on their website and you request a meeting, and you go there, and you've got 25 minutes, and there's some poor unsuspecting PhD from Big Pharma sitting opposite you, and you're the 10th presentation he's had to suffer that day, and you sit there with your slides and you pitch to him, and he or she or her, and they listen. And
is this to get funding?
No, it's usually to see if they would like to buy it.
Okay.
Because the strategy of most little biotechs is to get bought out. Mm-hmm. So if your data in phase 2, remember phase 2 is the killer trial. That's the one where most people fail. The drug doesn't do as it was meant to. But if it does show signals that it's working, then you might have something that big pharma want. Again, like Viralytics, the phase 2 data was particularly good. We got bought.
Yeah.
So everybody goes to all of these conferences. I mean, this is part of the CEO's job, and pitches the story about their technology. And so in the course of that, all the big pharma companies around the world keep on top of what's happening. So typically you'll go in and you'll say, this is our technology, and the pharma executive will say, what phase are you in? And you say phase 1, and they listen and they say, well, when you get some phase 2 data, come and see us.
Yeah.
That's the typical answer. Yeah. So it's a very important part of the process, because nobody wants to run in cancer a phase 3 clinical trial, because that could cost you anything from $100 to $500 million, and a little biotech doesn't have that capacity. So most biotechs are happy to take the money off the table in phase 2 and leave it to big pharma to get it approved.
Sounds like a case of big pharma, little biotech. Have you yourself, sounds like you've been to some of these events around the world to pitch yourself?
Hundreds of times. Hundreds of times.
Whereabouts are they located?
Oh, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Munich, London. Yeah.
Sounds like a pretty good job traveling around.
No, it's a dreadful job. You get sick of it.
Yeah.
But
that's always the appeal, isn't it? It's, young people think, oh, well, I'd love to travel the world with my job. And then they get there and, oh, I really wish I was back home with my family.
Yeah. But it's an essential function of being a biotech. I mean, German biotechs do it, American biotechs do it. Everybody does it because you want to get someone who's got the lifting power and the horsepower to take the drug out to approval. And you know, if you got your drug approved, do you want to have 100 foot soldiers on the ground in America wandering around hospitals and doctors selling your drug? You probably don't have those skills. It's better to leave it to the big companies. And if they offer you a good enough deal in phase 2, then it's probably worth your while taking the money.
So you got started in this in the US primarily. I understand there's a bit of a difference between regulation or perhaps what the government can provide. Does the government provide subsidies or something for this cancer tech in Australia?
Yeah, look, the Australian government actually has an incredibly good program for helping to fund biotech companies. So you get a cash rebate at the end of the year. So you add up how much you've spent, and I think it's running at about a 45% rebate. So I think the truth is that of the 100 plus listed ASX companies in biotech, probably 30% of them totally and utterly depend on getting that check back from the government each year. So it's a pretty good support for the industry, that's for sure.
So how's biotech doing in Australia?
It's doing well. 10 years ago, it was a completely different scenario. There was very little foreign investment. So today you have some of the very large life science institutional funds like OrbiMed and Cormorant and Baker Brothers in the US, Abingworth in London, investing in Australian biotech. So it's become more sophisticated, and we've had some pretty good exits, including, Viralytics, of which I was chair, and that's a homegrown drug out of Newcastle University in New South Wales that has a melanoma vaccine using it's not a vaccine, it's an oncolytic virus, so we use a virus from the common cold to kill cancer cells, and that was acquired by Merck last month for $502 million. And then you have Certex at the moment, which is being acquired for close to $2 billion. So the industry has certainly developed.
You said you used a virus, like something similar to a common cold, to get this treatment in. Is that used the CRISPR technique, or is that something else going on?
No, this is the virus that we use, or Viralytics uses, is called the Coxsackie virus, which is very closely related to the common cold. And it's a bit like a guided missile. It's only interested in one target, and that target, in this case, is on the surface of a melanoma cell. So if you think of a melanoma cell looking a bit like a tennis ball with little hairs on it, those hairs are receptors, which they call cavitac. And when you give this virus to the patient, the virus is only interested in attacking those receptors on the cancer cell, and then it goes into the cancer cell and basically kills the cell.
Is this the future of biotech, these incredibly specific viruses that come and attack one specific problem?
Well, look, the inventor of that drug, Professor Darren Shafran, when he thought up the idea of this 15 years ago, it was a little bit out there that you would give a virus to a patient on the basis that you thought it might cure cancer. But it's become respectable now. So it's certainly an approach that most of the big pharma companies in the world are looking at. But targeted therapies are very much the vogue. Now, the revolution that took place 5 or 6 years ago was the immuno-oncology revolution, where basically you alerted the immune system, you woke it up. See, the problem with a lot of cancers is that it looks like self. It's normal tissue, part of the body, and the immune surveillance doesn't recognise it as being nasty.
The receptors are the same.
Yeah, so the idea that you could somehow alert the immune system to the cancer being foreign was also a little bit out there, but there was a couple of drugs that have approved in the last 4 or 5, 6 years that changed that. So there's a revolution in that. In what they call small molecules, the approach is to have a very targeted approach to the disease. So finding out who's got a particular marker or a type of, the complexion of the cells, so that you create a drug just for that. Because if you give drugs to people that don't have those characteristics, then it's just a waste. They'll never work.
So these sound pretty specific. Would you say something like chemotherapy is at the other end of the spectrum, where it's completely non-specific?
Correct. So chemotherapy is a bit like throwing weed killer over the lawn. It works, but it kills a lot of other cells. Yeah. And that has been the mainstay of, or was the mainstay of cancer treatment for many years. What we want to do is to give a drug that only works on the cancer and it doesn't have the side effects.
Yeah, yeah. So of your research or the companies you have, are many of these new drugs specific, as in specific to the level of the virus, or are they more these compounds that work in different ways?
Well, my company's, now that Viralix has been taken over, I'm not involved in that. So companies that use viruses are not as common in the marketplace. I mean, the viruses are growing as a field in cancer treatment, but small molecule drugs and immuno-oncology drugs are the main areas. So I've got drugs for breast cancer, leukemia, gastric cancer, and these are all targeted drugs that are engineered to attack specific types of those cancers.
What's the process that really goes through to finding solutions to these cancers?
Well, it's a very, very protracted process, which is why people who invest in biotech should be aware that it's very patient capital. So,
what do you mean by patient capital?
That means you've got to wait a long time to get a return.
Fair enough.
Unless you're very lucky, where the drug shows extremely great promise very early in its life, and big pharma or a specialty biotech company like it and they buy you out.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen that very often. So the life of getting a drug going is pretty protracted. So it starts with some scientist having a view that something might do this and that, and then doing some experiments at the university or the medical institution, and then if the results look promising, then doing experiments in mice or dogs or non-human primates. And when all of that comes back, supporting the scientist's thesis that this might be a drug, the decision then is made, do we take, and I'm contracting all this, I'm simplifying it, but the decision is then made, do we really think we have something, and do we think it's safe enough now to put it into humans? Because it's in humans that the rubber hits the road for drugs. Yeah. All of the stuff beforehand is nice and it helps build the case, but in essence it's theoretical. So we can cure cancer in mice, but curing cancer in mice is not necessarily predictive of cancers in humans. So the time comes when you make the decision, and if everything, all the strands are pulled together and it looks positive that this might be a drug, you then do a phase 1 clinical trial. And that's the critical point, because in that trial you effectively work out, is it safe in humans? Then, when that's done and it's confirmed that it's safe, and you work out what dose to give the patient, because in the phase 1 trial, you work out levels of dosing, you then go into a phase 2. And the phase 2 clinical trial is the acid test, particularly in cancer. So this is the valley of death. This is where most cancer drugs get wiped out, is in phase 2, because there's nothing like a really robust, very well designed phase 2 clinical trial to kill a drug. It's just brutal. And that's why very few cancer drugs get approved, because the drug doesn't do in the phase 2 trial what you postulated it did all those early years when you were working in the lab in the test tubes.
So these phase 1 trials, are these what we see on, you turn on the news tonight and we see new cancer drug come out, cure cancer. Are these based on phase 1 trials, which is why we haven't seen these drugs today?
Well, they're often not even based on phase 1 trials. They're based on experiments done in the lab.
In mice and whatnot.
So they're a little bit naughty in terms of the way the media reports them, or even the institution sort of hypes it up, because what will happen between that idea and actually getting it towards the end and getting it approved, it's treacherous. And phase 2 is usually where the drug won't do as you expected it to do, and then you're finished.
So could this be like a 5 to 10 year process?
Yeah.
What sort of timeline are we going on here?
Yeah, it could be.
Okay, so where would you find like participants for these phase 1 and 2 trials?
Right, so in my view, the main instrument for conducting a clinical trial is from the FDA, and it's called an IND. It's an investigation new drug approval or application. So you submit a massive dossier to the FDA in Washington, explaining what you're going to do. It has all the safety and the toxicology, everything known about that drug, and you say, I would like to do a phase 1 clinical trial in breast cancer. And this is the drug, and this is what all the preclinical experiments show, and we've put it into dogs or mice or non-human primates, and they've all survived. And the FDA thinks about it, asks you a few questions or a lot of questions, and then they give you the okay. So once you've got the okay, you're good to go. So what you would do is, normally there's the inventor or the person the founder of the technology. It might be a professor at a university. So often you would start the trial at their institution, but you would hopefully be able to round up a bunch of other centres. If we were doing this in America, if we were doing it in Australia, we go on all the cancer centres in Melbourne and Sydney, and we get all the doctors, and we would say, we want to run this clinical trial, and they say, well, why should we put our patients on your breast cancer trial? Because we have Novartis and GSK and Pfizer and AstraZeneca. They've all got cancer drugs they want to trial, and they're asking us to put my patients, as the physician talking, on their drug. And so then you do a pitch why you think the drug has a good chance, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of solicitation that takes place.
So it kind of sounds like there's this whole research side of it, but then actually in getting these drugs to the market and getting them to people, there's this huge business and pitching element, almost like entrepreneurship in a way, to getting these drugs to the people. How can you comment on the difference in someone who's studying or wants to go into the field, the avenues they could go down, whether it be taking more down like a business route or a research route?
Well, so there's in the biotech industry that I'm involved in, there's really two avenues. One is through the science and academia, and the other is the commercial side, where you're running the business or you're involved in things like capital raisings or setting up trial centres and all the rest of it. A lot of people start out with a scientific or medical background, and they might work in a lab or work for one of the big pharma companies, and then after a number of years they'll join a biotech. Now, little biotechs, as we have many in Australia, tend to be a little bit more virtual than the rest of the world. So a lot of the work is outsourced. And so the people that work in it, there's the CEO and a few other people, they tend to be multi-skilled. So, in a small biotech in Australia, the CEO would probably spend half their time raising money, because biotech is a black hole for capital. You've got lead times of 0 to 10 years to get something, perhaps, which means it has to be funded. And clinical trials are terribly expensive, so you need money. So the biotech CEO here in the US spends a lot of time on the road going to see investment institutions. But you obviously have to have a knowledge of the drug that you're talking about. You can't go and pitch for money and not have a clue about the
Can't be too
fundamental.
money hungry without having the knowledge behind it.
You have to have the fundamental science. And so anybody that's looking to go into it, I mean, you can approach it from a purely commercial point of view, but when you're in the business, you obviously have to know your technology inside out.
Yeah.
Absolutely inside out. Now, if you've got a PhD, you're going to get up to speed a lot quicker than a person who's got maybe just a straight MBA and is a finance person, because if you're in the field of immuno-oncology, that is pretty complex and it requires a lot of work to become very, very familiar with it.
Have you come across people you've worked with that just maybe weren't on top of it, didn't know the material as much as you thought they should?
Well, I'm not a great fan of people who come from big pharma and into the biotech industry and want to have executive positions which are of a commercial nature, because small biotech is tough. You've got to do everything. One hand on the coffee machine, another on the photocopier, and another thing doing something somewhere else. So it's very hands-on, and you have to have a familiarity with capital markets, because without money, you perish. And you have to spend a lot of time going around to brokers and fund managers explaining what you're doing. So you need to have that ability. I mean, there's many big pharma people, or there's some in Australia that have made the transition and they're superb CEOs. But I think it's harder.
You said that you have people on the ground selling drugs in America. I think I've seen that as a very key difference between the pharmaceuticals in America and here, that it seems a lot more free over there. Like, how would you describe the difference? Like, the FDA, of course, is the gold standard there. Why do people want that FDA approval?
Well, because America is the largest drug market in the world.
Okay.
There's 300 million or 330 million people, and they all take far too many drugs.
Yeah.
And if you've been to America and watched the television, all the ads are full of prescription drugs being promoted. Ask your doctor for this drug, and there's all these families holding hands.
What's your view on that, being able to sell drugs like that over advertisement?
I mean, I guess the gatekeeper of whether you get that drug has to be the physician. So, I mean, most people wouldn't in Australia wouldn't have a clue about what drug to ask for.
No, brand names at all.
Yeah, but in America, it's very heavily promoted. So people want to get their drugs approved in America because that's the market where the money is. Now, of course, that's starting to change with China, with the middle class, and of course, it's going to be a massive cancer market there as well. So,
what's going on in China?
It's on fire. It's on fire. So, you'd go to the conferences 4 years ago. There'd be a lot of Chinese companies listening, and they'd ask for data, and they'd sign a confidentiality agreement. You'd send your stuff to them, and then you never hear from them again. But now, it's massive. There's a land grab taking place there. So their homegrown Chinese biotechs are sprouting up everywhere. Shanghai's building a massive biotech hub, but they're also investing in companies overseas. So in the case of Viralytics, for example, they took 14% of us in January before we were bought by Merck and paid us $30 million for that stake. They're buying American biotech companies all the time.
What's fueling this in China? Is there a change in regulation or something?
Yeah, the Chinese FDA has loosened up considerably from where it was before. But you think about it, I don't know what the population of China is. You've got, 1.3 billion or something. And you've got a middle class, which is going to be 200 or 300 million people. You've got health insurance, and they want drugs. Mm-hmm. You've got some population characteristics which are classic for cancer. You've got the biggest smoking market in the world. You've got obesity, which is closely related to cancer. They all need drugs. And so that will be a gold mine for a lot of companies up there.
Yeah, it's really huge what's going on in China.
Yeah.
So testing your drugs, when does it become more cost effective to do it in-house and get your own lab? Or is it something that the universities can do better for you?
Yeah, so let's be quite clear. By the time you get the drug into a phase 1 human clinical trial, most of the research is over and you've made the drug.
Okay.
You've made the experimental drug. So the main activity of the biotech then is to shepherd the drug through the clinical trial process, and also manufacture drug, and you usually have a third party.
Yeah.
You wouldn't make the drug yourself.
No.
But in the lead up, which could be 6, 7, 8 or 9, 10 years, in big pharma, they do a lot of that work themselves, but it's just not practical for a small
Yeah.
biotech to do all that work and have their own
Yeah.
wet labs and set up, animal experiments and all the rest of it. So it tends to be, so for example, a number of my drugs I've licensed in, for example, from Yale or New York University, and the drug is being worked on, but you pay them a fee, like an R&D fee, to continue the work. You don't do it yourself.
Okay.
Because you don't have the skill, and you want to capture the inventor, the founder, the professor.
Yeah.
You want them to be part of the team, and they're working in their labs, and they've usually got the labs set up at the university or the medical institution. There's no point copying that.
So all these scientists in biotech in Australia, whereabouts are they working?
Oh,
Is it mainly universities, or is there a lot of private labs going on?
yeah. I mean, there'd be a dozen people at Peter Mac and the Garvan Institute in Sydney and that sort of thing. Yeah. But not that many of the biotech companies. If you went out to see them, they'd take you to the lab block, and there'd be 20 scientists working under hoods and that, and mixing that. That is not that common.
Yeah.
That's pretty unusual.
That's more big pharma style.
Correct.
Yeah. 'Cause I think we see when everyone's first thought in biotech and drug development always is the big pharma, and the big pharma really, fair enough, to have the market captured.
Yeah.
But where do you think, when does a biotech company upgrade to big pharma? Or what pushes them in that direction? Is it
They
always?
don't.
Yeah.
They don't. They generally get bought out if they're any good.
Okay.
Because
that's the goal, I guess.
Yeah, they get bought out either in a phase 1 or a phase 2 clinical trial, because they're just not equipped to run a massive phase 3 trial. I mean, some of them go it alone, but they're rare. They're very rare.
Yeah. I was thinking, we were talking earlier, agriculture overseas, agricultural biotech really, and all the uses it can have there. What are some of the applications for agricultural biotech in general, say for in livestock, for example?
Yeah, look, it's not an area that I've done a lot of work in, but I'm chairman of a private company in Queensland called Semexion, and basically it has a technology for gender selection in biotech using antibodies, and effectively what it does is that it can, by including an additive in animal semen, they can determine the outcome, whether it's going to be a male or a female. So in the dairy industry, the farmers want cows, they don't want males or bulls.
Yeah.
In China, for example, and a lot of Asian countries, they don't like male pork to eat because it has a thing that's called boar taint, and apparently male pork meat has the smell. I don't know of it, but apparently to those people that eat a lot of pork, it's very easily recognisable. So can you imagine if you could say to a Chinese pig farmer, we can ensure that you only have sows, from your sows, the market's enormous. So that's an application.
So this is just a whole other big area of biotech, and we've just been talking about the cancer area today, and that's huge enough as it is. It'd be really interesting to see where all these other areas branch out to and where they might even combine in the future. But Paul, I'd like to thank you for coming down here today. I've had a lot of my questions answered. I don't know about you guys, but thank you so much for coming down, and it's been a pleasure to meet you.
My pleasure, thank you.
Cheers.